Can you please say something about the underlying network? So what do you need? Do you use VLANs or plain or switches or whatsoever?
Yeah. So for the actual workload clusters, by default, the cluster API will create a VXLAN network in Neutron. So in the same way that you would create a tenant network, just a normal tenant network, it would just rely on that. The way that, and then inside the cluster, like I showed earlier, is Calico as the CNI. The communication between control plane, when I say control plane, is like management cluster into the workload clusters, aka the cluster we just created. That, in old school Magnum, the cluster would dial out to the control plane. But with Cluster API, the Cluster API dials out to the cluster. And so the issue with that is when, with Magnum, we can easily create what we called isolated clusters. So right now, this cluster has a floating IP. That's how the API is exposed. You might not want that. So in order to get an isolated cluster where there is no floating IP, we created a component called the Magnum Cluster API Proxy. And this will run on all of your hosts. If you're using ML2 OVS, you would run it on all of your network hosts where DHCP and L3 agents are running. And if you're running OVN, you would run it on your compute hosts. And what it does is eventually it exposes through the network namespace into the network, or exposes the API through the network namespace as a Kubernetes service. And that's how that communication goes out. But inherently, this solution, if you're not going to be using floating IPs, or even if you use this, there's no specific network requirements that are done. It's just, it needs an OpenStack installation. So nothing beyond what your normal OpenStack installation would include.